The Hacienda de los Cuervos stood like a giant scar upon the rolling hills of Puebla, its tall stone walls casting long shadows across the land. To the passing traveler, it appeared majestic, sprawling courtyards, arched windows, and towers that caught the morning sun. Yet behind its beauty, whispers of darkness had long clung to its stories of betrayal, cruelty, and secrets buried deep beneath its polished floors. Long before the year 1847, when Mexico found itself torn by war and foreign invasion, the Hacienda had already become infamous. Its very name, de los Cuervos, of the crows, was said to come from the blackbirds that circled the estate's fields at all hours, as though drawn to death. Locals swore they never left, not even in seasons when food was scarce. The peasants said the crows carried the souls of those who had perished unjustly within the hacienda's walls. The hacienda was built in the late 1700s by Don Esteban de la Serna, a wealthy landowner whose fortune came from sugar and maize. He was a man of ambition and ruthless resolve. To him, land was not sacred, nor were the people who worked it. His vision was to make his estate one of the richest in Puebla, and he succeeded. But success came at a terrible cost. Indigenous families who had lived on the land for centuries were forced into labor under conditions harsher than chains. Their ancestral fields were seized, their rivers redirected to feed the hacienda's mills, and their freedoms suffocated beneath endless toil. Don Esteban rewarded loyalty with scraps and punished resistance with brutality. There were stories of men whipped until their flesh hung in ribbons, of women forced into servitude not only in the fields but in the master's chambers, and of children worked to exhaustion. With every stone laid into the hacienda's walls, resentment grew, yet fear kept rebellion silent, at least for a time. As years passed, strange tales began to circulate. Workers reported hearing cries at night, not of animals, but of human voices echoing from the cellars. Some spoke of a hidden chamber where Don Esteban carried out punishments away from the eyes of the overseers. Others swore they had seen men go into those chambers but never come out again. Priests from nearby villages would occasionally be summoned to bless the grounds, but even they admitted something was wrong. One, Father Gabriel, wrote in his diary that the walls seemed to drink the prayers and return them empty. His notes, later found long after his death, described the hacienda as a place where cruelty and greed have taken root deeper than the oldest tree. The local community came to believe that the estate itself was cursed, that every act of injustice seeped into its stones, making it not merely a place but a living testament to human cruelty. When Don Esteban died, the hacienda passed to his son, Don Rafael. But instead of bringing change, Rafael deepened the legacy of fear. Unlike his father, who at least maintained the facade of order, Rafael was reckless. He indulged in pleasures, squandered wealth, and treated the people as though they were less than animals. He was known to host lavish feasts where food spilled in abundance while the laborers outside starved. It was under his rule that the name Hacienda de los Cuervos spread beyond Puebla. Travelers who stayed overnight claimed to hear chains rattling in the courtyards or screams carried by the wind. Some never made it back to their destinations. Their families would come searching, but they were told they must have left. They are not here. Few dared to press further. By the early 1800s, the hacienda was both a symbol of wealth and a warning. People avoided its grounds unless forced to work there. Mothers told their children not to wander near its fields after dark, lest the crows carry them away. And always those black-winged birds hovered in the skies, as though they alone bore witness to what happened behind the hacienda's gates. But the true darkness of the hacienda was not only in its cruelty, it was in the way it tied itself to power. During the turbulent years of Mexico's independence and political upheaval, the owners of the Hacienda de los Cuervos secured their wealth by aligning with whichever side promised them control. They supplied soldiers when it suited them, then switched allegiances when the winds of war changed direction. This opportunism came at the expense of the poor. Families were uprooted, fields burned, and lives destroyed in the name of maintaining the hacienda's dominance. It was said that Don Rafael once remarked, "Nations may change, but the hacienda remains." To him, the estate was eternal, untouchable, but history has a way of proving such arrogance wrong. By 1847, when U.S. forces marched into Mexican territory, the hacienda's reputation was already that of a haunted empire. Yet its wealth still glittered, an irresistible prize in a land torn by war. But more dangerous than the invaders were the people who had long suffered under its shadow. The peasants who worked the fields remembered their fathers' pain, their mothers' humiliation, and their children's hunger. They had endured decades of silence, but the winds of rebellion were stirring. War brought chaos, and chaos gave them courage. They began to meet in secret, whispering of justice, of tearing down the walls that had imprisoned them for generations. Old men told stories of the first injustices, reminding the young that their suffering was not new. And the crows, always the crows, seemed to gather in greater numbers, as if preparing for a storm. The Hacienda de los Cuervos was no longer simply a house of power. It had become a symbol of everything that chained the people: greed, cruelty, and oppression. And in the shadows of its past, seeds of vengeance were already being sown, seeds that would soon grow into a reckoning. The Hacienda de los Cuervos was more than just a sprawling estate of fertile lands and crumbling stone walls. For those who worked its soil, it became a symbol of chains invisible yet crushing. In the heart of Puebla, where the mountains watched over valleys of corn, sugarcane, and coffee, the hacienda was both lifeline and prison. Its fields promised food, yet the hands that cultivated them remained perpetually hungry. Its walls were grand, yet those who slept within them had no shelter of their own. The hacienda system, deeply entrenched in Mexico during the 19th century, was built not merely on economics but on control. The patron, or master, ruled as both employer and judge, and the peons beneath him bore the weight of his decisions. For the workers of the Hacienda de los Cuervos, that weight was unbearable. The oppression of the hacienda was subtle in its beginning but suffocating in its outcome. The workers were tied to the land through debt peonage, a cycle so vicious it rivaled the old shackles of slavery. When a family arrived at the hacienda gates seeking employment, the patron would offer an advance money for clothing, seeds, or medicine. Desperate and hungry, they accepted. What they didn't realize was that this advance was a chain. The debt was recorded in the hacienda's ledger, a great book with ink as black as crow feathers. Every week, the labor of men, women, and even children was counted against the debt. Yet somehow, the numbers never favored the workers. The patron charged inflated prices for the food in the hacienda's store, deducted the cost of tools, and even demanded payment for the use of mules. No matter how much they toiled under the sun, the balance always grew heavier against them. A man might work 10 years only to find that his debt had doubled. If he died, the debt passed on to his children. The hacienda became a cage, and escape was not just difficult, it was impossible. The workers whispered that the hacienda was cursed, that no family ever left its grasp, just as no crow ever flew out from its shadow. It was not by accident that the estate bore the name Los Cuervos, the Crows. At dawn, black flocks circled above the fields, swooping low as if mocking the peons. Their caws became an omen, a reminder that even the sky was beyond reach. The patron himself embraced the name, wearing it like a badge of power. From the balcony of his manor house, he would watch the workers bent over the earth, his eyes cold and calculating. Rumors spread that he could spot the faintest sign of rebellion, the way a crow spots a dying animal from miles away. The workers felt his gaze like a weight pressing down on their backs. Children grew up believing the patron had eyes like a crow, able to see in the dark and punish without mercy. The crows and the patron became one in the minds of the oppressed, black wings, sharp beaks, and endless hunger. Daily life at the Hacienda de los Cuervos was a routine of suffering. Before the sun rose, the workers were already in the fields. The men cut cane or plowed, the women carried baskets of maize, and the children gathered firewood or tended to animals. They labored under the punishing heat, their stomachs gnawed by hunger, their backs scarred by endless toil. Meals were meager, tortillas of coarse maize, sometimes beans, rarely meat. Hunger was a constant shadow, yet despite the poverty, the patron demanded fiestas on religious holidays, forcing the workers to contribute money they did not have. They were required to dance, sing, and give thanks to the very man who kept them enslaved by debt. Whippings were not uncommon. A man accused of laziness might be tied to a post and beaten before the others as an example. A woman who dared to question her wages might be thrown out of her hut, left with her children in the cold night air. The Hacienda's chapel, meant to be a place of faith, was used instead as a stage for sermons that reinforced obedience. God placed the patron above you, and you must serve him. Faith, instead of being a comfort, was twisted into another instrument of oppression. Yet beneath the crushing weight of oppression, the human spirit still fought to survive. The workers of Los Cuervos developed their own quiet forms of resistance. At night, around smoky fires, elders told stories of freedom, of the wars for independence, of heroes who had risen against impossible odds. They passed on songs that spoke of hope, though they sang them in hushed tones so the patron's overseers would not hear. Some men sabotaged tools so work would be slowed. Women would secretly hide kernels of maize in their skirts, planting them in secret patches of land far from the hacienda's gaze. Children carved crosses into trees, praying for God to send deliverance. The crows themselves became symbols in these whispered stories. Where the patron saw them as his emblem, the workers began to see them differently, not as harbingers of despair, but as witnesses. They said the crows remembered everything. That one day when justice came, the crows would carry the story of their suffering to heaven. Perhaps the heaviest burden was not the hunger or the whippings, but the belief that nothing could ever change. Generation after generation grew up believing they were born only to serve. The hacienda taught them to bow their heads, to silence their anger, to accept their place. This psychological weight crushed dreams before they could take flight. A child who dreamed of leaving was told, "No one leaves Los Cuervos." A mother who prayed for a better life for her son saw him grow into the same war, out laborer as his father. A young girl who dared to imagine herself free was quickly married off, her youth traded for more hands in the fields. Oppression was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was the stripping away of identity, the erasure of hope, the molding of human beings into shadows of themselves. And yet, it is here that the story of Los Cuervos begins to matter most. For though the oppression was suffocating, it did not completely extinguish the flame of dignity. The workers carried inside them an unspoken truth. They were more than this, and one day change would come. The Hacienda de los Cuervos teaches us something universal. Oppression thrives not only on power but on silence. It survives when people believe they are too weak to resist, too bound to rise, too small to matter. But history has shown time and again that even the heaviest chains eventually crack when hearts begin to believe in freedom. The weight of oppression is real, but it is never eternal. The year was 1847, and the winds of conflict blew across Mexico like a storm waiting to break. The land was not only scarred by the war between Mexico and the United States, but also torn apart by the age-old struggle between the powerful landowners and the poor peasants who toiled on their estates. Puebla, with its fertile valleys and strategic location, felt the full weight of this storm, and at the heart of this turbulent landscape stood the Hacienda de los Cuervos, an estate as mysterious as it was feared. The hacienda had long been ruled with an iron fist by the Cuervo family, whose name itself meant the crows. Like those black-winged birds that circled overhead, the Cuervos thrived on death, despair, and secrecy. To the peasants, the hacienda was a prison without chains, a place where sweat, blood, and tears were exchanged for survival. Yet by 1847, whispers spread that something was shifting in the shadows, that even the cruelest dynasty could not hold back the gathering storm forever. The Mexican-American War was raging, and Puebla had become a passageway for armies. Soldiers marched, supplies were stolen, and families were displaced. The poor peasants of the haciendas suffered the most. They were forced to provide food, shelter, and sometimes their very sons for the war. While common families gave everything, the landowning elites, including the Cuervos, used the chaos to tighten their grip. The Cuervos hoarded grain while children starved. They profited from war by selling supplies at double the price, even as their own workers fainted in the fields from hunger. Yet their arrogance blinded them. They believed the peasants would forever remain silent, too broken to fight, too dependent to resist. But storms gather in silence. A dark cloud forms long before the first strike of lightning. And in Puebla, the dark cloud was swelling. In the small villages that surrounded the Hacienda de los Cuervos, peasants gathered at night, huddled around candles in mud, brick huts. They spoke of their hunger, of their dead, of their endless servitude. They also spoke of the cruelty of Don Esteban de los Cuervos, the master of the estate in 1847. He was known to beat men for failing to meet impossible quotas and to punish women who dared to defy him. But among these hushed gatherings, a new voice began to rise. That voice belonged to Ismael, a young man who had grown up under the shadow of the hacienda. His father had died in the fields, his mother had wasted away from hunger, and his brothers had been conscripted into the war, never to return. Ismael had nothing left to lose, and in that emptiness he found fire. Ismael began to tell the villagers, "We are not crows to feed their hunger. We are the storm they fear." His words stirred something long buried, a memory of dignity, a hunger not just for bread, but for freedom. Inside the hacienda's thick stone walls, the Cuervo family celebrated lavish feasts. They roasted meats, poured imported wine, and laughed at the misery of those outside their gates. To them, the war and the suffering were nothing more than opportunities to tighten their wealth. Don Esteban believed that peasants were like oxen. They could complain, they could grow weak, but in the end they would always pull the plow. But Don Esteban did not notice how different the air felt in 1847. He did not notice how the peasants no longer bowed as deeply, how they no longer sang while working, how they gathered in silent groups when they thought no overseer was watching. The Cuervos lived in luxury, but the silence outside their walls was not the silence of obedience. It was the silence of thunder about to break. The storm gathered its spark one night when a young girl named Maria Luisa, no older than 12, was caught stealing bread from the hacienda's kitchen. Her family had not eaten for days, and her ribs showed through her thin skin. Instead of mercy, Don Esteban ordered her beaten in front of the villagers as a warning. But as the lash struck her frail back, something in the crowd shifted. The villagers, who had always turned away, did not look down this time. They watched, their fists clenched, their jaws tightened, and when Ismael lifted the crying girl into his arms, whispering, "Never again," the words spread like wildfire, "Never again." It was the moment when fear began to break. The Cuervos had meant to frighten the people into silence. Instead, they had planted the seed of rebellion. That summer, the skies over Puebla mirrored the mood of the land. Clouds gathered daily, heavy with rain, but refused to break. The air grew thick and oppressive, as though the earth itself held its breath. Farmers said the land was waiting, that the storm in the sky was only the reflection of the storm in their hearts. Every day, men and women in the villages grew bolder. They shared food in secret. They refused to sing the old work songs of obedience, and they whispered of a day when the gates of the hacienda would no longer stand. Even the priests, who once preached patience and submission, began to quote scriptures of justice and liberation. The hacienda was surrounded not by armed soldiers, but by something far more dangerous, a people who had stopped being afraid. By late autumn of 1847, the Hacienda de los Cuervos stood like a fortress against the growing storm. Its towers rose above the fields, its gates remained locked, and its overseers rode out with whips and muskets to enforce order. Yet inside, the family could feel it, the uneasy quiet, the watchful eyes, the sense that the peasants were no longer broken. One evening, Don Esteban looked out from his balcony at the workers returning from the fields. They did not shuffle, they did not bow. They walked upright, their faces unreadable. For the first time, Don Esteban felt a chill creep up his spine. He did not yet know it, but the storm he had ignored all his life was almost ready to break upon him. The gathering storm was no longer just in the skies above Puebla. It was in the hearts of the people, in the fire of their hunger, in the whisper of their defiance. And when such a storm gathers, nothing, not even the thickest walls of a hacienda, can hold it back forever. The year was 1847, and the Hacienda de los Cuervos had long been a place where silence covered pain, where generations of peons bent their backs under endless labor, their sweat enriching a master's table they would never eat from. But on one unforgettable night, the hush of submission gave way to the roar of revolt, and the hacienda's stones bore witness to a fire that would burn not only wood and walls but centuries of fear. The night of fire did not begin with flames, it began with whispers. For weeks, in the sugarcane fields and under the moonlit courtyards, the workers had spoken in hushed tones. They spoke of hunger, of bruised bodies, of children who died before they could walk because their mother's milk had dried from overwork. They spoke of the patron, Don Esteban, whose lash was feared more than God's judgment. And most of all, they spoke of change of an ending. It was Ignacio, a man of quiet strength, who first uttered the words that sparked courage in others. If we die tomorrow, let it be as free men, not as dogs. His voice carried not the desperation of madness, but the conviction of someone who had been broken too many times and would bend no more. Slowly, others rallied around him. Young men with blistered hands, women with fire in their eyes, and even the elderly who had known nothing but servitude but longed to see their grandchildren live differently. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, the plan was set in motion. The men sharpened machetes used for cane cutting. The women gathered torches and clay jars filled with oil. No one ate much that night. Their stomachs churned with dread and anticipation. A storm brewed in the distance, but within the hacienda walls, another storm was preparing to break loose. When the church bell tolled midnight, the silence was broken. A torch was lit in the corner of the workers' quarters, its glow a signal that spread like wildfire through the compound. One by one, others lifted their torches until the night flickered with the light of rebellion. The first cries rose into the air, awe defiant, carrying centuries of anguish. Basta, enough. The sound cut through the stillness of the night like a blade, waking the overseers in the master's house. By the time they rushed into the courtyard, armed with whips and muskets, the workers had already surged forward. The gates of the storage barns were set aflame. The oil caught quickly, sending thick plumes of smoke into the starless sky. The sugarcane dried in the lofts burned like tinder, crackling and roaring as if the land itself had chosen sides. Horses neighed wildly in panic, chickens scattered, dogs howled. The order of the hacienda unraveled in a single breath. Don Esteban himself stormed out of the manor, fury dripping from every step. He held a pistol, his white shirt glowing in the firelight. For years his voice had commanded unquestioned obedience, but that night his words fell on deaf ears. Ignacio and a dozen men faced him at the steps of the house. "Back to your quarters," Esteban bellowed, firing a shot into the air. The bullet hissed, but no one moved. Ignacio, steady as stone, stepped forward. "No more," he said. "Tonight we break your chains." The fight erupted in a blur of chaos. Overseers fired muskets, but their numbers were few and fear gnawed at their aim. Workers, once cowed, swung machetes with precision, their blows fueled by rage and hunger. Women hurled jars of oil against the wooden doors of the hacienda house, then set them alight until the great beams groaned under the heat. The fire spread quickly, curtains ignited, furniture cracked, and portraits of ancestors, symbols of power and arrogance, curled into ash. For the first time, Don Esteban's fortress trembled, and his screams were drowned by the roar of flames. Some claimed he fled into the fields, never to be seen again. Others whispered that he perished in the inferno, consumed by the very wealth he had stolen. The truth was never certain, but the legend was clear. The master's reign ended that night. As the manor collapsed, sparks rained down like stars over the crowd. Some wept tears of fear, of release, of hope. Others fell to their knees, clutching the earth, as if to ask forgiveness from the land itself for allowing so much blood to be spilled upon it. The fire was not only destruction, it was purification, a symbolic cleansing of centuries of submission. Yet the night of fire was not without cost. Many fell in the struggle, men cut down by bullets, women struck by flying debris. The screams of the wounded mingled with the crackle of burning wood, and the survivors carried scars that would never fully heal. Still, as dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, the survivors stood taller than they ever had. The hacienda, once a monument to wealth and control, lay in ashes, but in those ashes seeds were planted. The workers had declared themselves human, worthy of dignity, and their act of rebellion sent ripples through the valleys of Puebla. Other haciendas heard of the fire, and fear crept into the hearts of landowners. Some tightened their grip, others loosened it, sensing the tide of history turning against them. That night became more than a story. It became a memory passed down in whispers and songs. Mothers told their children, "We were not always silent. There was a night when we stood up." The fire that consumed the Hacienda de los Cuervos burned long after the last embers cooled. In the eyes of outsiders, it may have seemed like nothing more than an isolated riot, a violent clash of oppressed and oppressor. But to those who lived it, it was a birth. The birth of courage, the birth of dignity, the birth of hope that the chains of yesterday did not have to bind tomorrow. The night of fire stands as a reminder. When injustice builds its house on the backs of the broken, it should not be surprised when those same backs rise up to shake it down. The flames that lit the sky in 1847 were not merely destructive. They were illuminating. They showed that even the most silenced voices, when joined together, could roar louder than any master's command. When the smoke cleared from the Hacienda de los Cuervos, the land bore scars far deeper than the blackened stone walls or the charred remains of the once mighty estate. It was not just a building that had burned, it was an idea, a way of life, and a symbol of domination that had long stood over the people of Puebla. Yet even in the ashes of what many had once feared, silence settled over the valley like a heavy shroud. And in that silence lived both grief and freedom, sorrow and relief, loss and rebirth. The hacienda was reduced to a skeletal shell. Its grand corridors, where boots once echoed with the march of overseers, now lay in rubble. The massive gates that once barred peasants from entering without permission were twisted into warped iron relics. The air smelled of burnt maize, scorched flesh, and the faint sweetness of old wood that had fed the fire. For days, smoke curled upward into the sky, visible for miles, like a funeral pyre marking the end of an era. The community gathered in silence at the edge of the ruins. Some wept openly, mourning not the hacienda itself, but the lives lost in the inferno, lives of servants, children, and innocents who had no choice in the violence that erupted. Others stood with their heads held high, believing the flames had finally broken the back of oppression. And yet none could speak freely about what had truly happened that night. Whispers filled the air. Some said the peasants had risen together, lighting torches and casting the first flames onto the rooftops. Others believed the fire was divine retribution, punishment for decades of cruelty carried out within those walls. A few murmured darker tales, that the hacendado's own greed had sparked the blaze, that hidden treasures stored in the cellars had been cursed, igniting their own destruction. No one could agree, and perhaps no one wanted to. For in the ambiguity of silence there was safety. The survivors, those who had served the estate as cooks, maids, and laborers, were torn between fear and hope. They had lived their lives under the yoke of the hacienda, told that they were powerless and bound forever to its rule. Now, with its walls gone, they were free in a way they had never imagined. But freedom came with uncertainty. Where would they go? How would they live? Could they survive without the very structure that had chained them? In the weeks that followed, Puebla seemed to stand still. Officials from the city came to investigate, questioning villagers and surveying the ruins. But whenever they asked who was responsible, they were met with blank stares and downcast eyes. No one admitted to striking the match. No one named a leader. The silence of the people was louder than any testimony. It was a pact unspoken yet deeply understood. Whatever had happened that night was a secret buried in ash, a truth that belonged only to those who had endured it. But silence did not mean forgetting. Every family carried fragments of memory. Some remembered the cries of children carried out of the flames, others the chants of men who stood their ground against overseers, and still others the terror of watching fire consume the only world they had known. These memories were stitched into the fabric of the community, shared cautiously in kitchens at night or whispered to children as cautionary tales. For the landowners of Puebla, the destruction of Hacienda de los Cuervos was a warning. Many tightened their grip on their workers, fearing rebellion. Others, shaken by the event, began to treat their peons with more humanity, sensing that oppression carried a cost too high to sustain. The hacienda's ruins became a symbol, both of fear for those in power and of possibility for those below. Years passed and nature slowly reclaimed the estate. Vines crawled over scorched stone, owls nested in broken rafters, and weeds sprouted where once there had been manicured gardens. The land itself seemed to breathe again, freed from the weight of cruelty. Children played among the ruins, their laughter echoing where once there had been orders barked and cries suppressed. And yet, even in play, they were told never to forget what had happened there. The silence became part of Puebla's identity. Travelers who passed by asked about the hacienda, but locals only shrugged, offering vague gestures and halves. Miles, it burned. They would say nothing more. To pry further was to cross an invisible line, for the memory belonged to those who had carried its weight, not to outsiders hungry for gossip. In this silence, there was also dignity. The people refused to allow the story to be twisted by officials or romanticized by landowners. Instead, they held it close, preserving its truth in fragments of oral tradition passed carefully from one generation to the next. Grandmothers told grandchildren about the cruelty of the hacendado, fathers warned sons about the dangers of unchecked power, and mothers reminded daughters of the strength that comes when a community unites. And so, the aftermath of the Hacienda de los Cuervos was not simply ruin, it was transformation. It was the rebirth of a people who had once believed they were voiceless, but who discovered in fire that they could reshape their destiny. They did not celebrate openly, nor did they write grand histories. Instead, they chose silence as their shield and memory as their weapon. By the time decades had passed, the hacienda was nothing more than a ghost. Its ruins stood as a reminder to those who dared to rebuild such tyranny that the oppressed would not remain silent forever. The story of its fall inspired quiet strength in the people of Puebla, who learned that even against overwhelming odds, justice has a way of finding its moment, sometimes through courts, sometimes through revolutions, and sometimes through fire. The silence of the people was not the silence of fear, but of power. It was the silence of a community that refused to betray itself, that chose unity over betrayal, and that understood the weight of what had been done. For in their silence they spoke a truth that could not be erased. The Hacienda de los Cuervos had fallen, and with it a chapter of oppression, and in that silence hope was born. History is more than a collection of old dates, battles, and forgotten names. It is a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes hazy, but always capable of reflecting the deepest truths about human nature. The tragedy of the Hacienda de los Cuervos, with its wealth built on suffering, its rebellion born of desperation, and its fiery end, is not just a story buried in 1847 Puebla. It is a warning, a lesson, and a call to action for us today. Though nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Night of Fire, the echoes of the hacienda still rumble through our modern lives. Its story reminds us of 3 truths. Oppression breeds resistance, silence fuels injustice, and collective courage can rewrite the future. If we fail to learn from those truths, we risk repeating them. The Hacienda de los Cuervos stood as a monument of wealth and grandeur, yet its foundation was soaked in the sweat and blood of the peasantry. The owners believed they could extract endless labor while denying dignity to the very people who kept the estate alive. This illusion of power, that one group can prosper indefinitely at the expense of another, has been repeated throughout history, from colonial plantations to industrial factories to modern exploitative systems. The lesson is clear: oppression is not sustainable. Just as the peons of Puebla eventually rebelled against the cruelty of their overseers, so too do modern societies erupt when inequality becomes unbearable. Whether it is workers demanding fair wages, citizens marching against corruption, or marginalized groups demanding recognition, history shows us that the human spirit resists chains, visible or invisible. For us today, this means we must examine the systems around us, our workplaces, our communities, our governments, and ask who is bearing the cost of our comfort, who is invisible while others thrive, because the truth is, injustice may be ignored for a season, but it cannot remain hidden forever. One of the most chilling aspects of the Hacienda de los Cuervos was not just the cruelty of the masters, but the silence of those who watched it unfold. Local authorities knew of the abuses. Priests heard confessions dripping with guilt and despair. Neighbors whispered about screams that pierced the night, and yet no one spoke loudly enough to stop it, until fire forced everyone to pay attention. This is perhaps the greatest danger of silence. It gives permission to oppression. By looking away, by convincing ourselves it is not my problem, we strengthen the chains that bind others. Silence is a cloak that shields injustice. And how relevant is this today? How many times do we scroll past suffering on a screen? How often do we shrug at corruption, exploitation, or cruelty because raising our voice feels risky or inconvenient? The Hacienda teaches us that silence has consequences, not just for the oppressed, but for the entire community. When injustice is allowed to fester, it eventually explodes, consuming both victim and perpetrator. The peasants of Puebla were not armed generals or wealthy leaders. They had no titles, no grand resources, no position in society. What they did have was courage. Courage forged in suffering, sharpened by unity. The night of fire was not the action of a single hero, but of many voices rising together. That is the essence of change, collective courage. This is as true today as it was in 1847. Social progress, whether it be workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights, or independence movements, has always been won when ordinary people dared to act together. The lesson here is not to romanticize violence, but to recognize the unstoppable force of solidarity. Alone, fear dominates. Together, courage grows. The Hacienda de los Cuervos looked magnificent on the surface. Its sprawling fields, its carriages, its stone walls. To outsiders it was a symbol of prosperity, yet inside it was rotting, built on cruelty, sustained by exploitation, destined for destruction. This contradiction remains alive in our world today. Corporations flaunt their profits while hiding the mistreatment of workers. Politicians boast of growth while the poor struggle to eat. Influencers display luxury while ignoring the suffering that finances their lifestyles. The lesson of the Hacienda is timeless. Wealth without justice is an illusion. No empire, business, or nation can endure if it ignores the humanity of those at its foundation. For us, it is a call to measure success not by how high the walls rise, but by how many lives are lifted. The Hacienda burned, but the system that created it did not disappear overnight. Many other estates in Mexico continued to operate with similar cruelty well into the late 19th century. Why? Because memory fades, lessons are forgotten, and greed blinds generations. This is why the story of the Hacienda de los Cuervos matters, not to glorify its fire, but to keep its warning alive. Every generation faces the temptation to ignore the past, to believe this time is different. But history whispers otherwise. If we fail to learn, we will repeat the same mistakes in new disguises. The Hacienda de los Cuervos is gone, its ashes scattered, its wealth dissolved, but its message lives on. A society built on oppression cannot stand. Our task is not only to remember, but to act differently, to ensure that the shadows of the past do not become the prisons of the future. When we hear of the Hacienda de los Cuervos, we are not just listening to the story of peasants and masters, of fire and rebellion. We are hearing our own story because every generation faces its own hacienda, its own place where wealth and power collide with justice and dignity. The question is, will we remain silent or will we rise together? If we listen closely, the whispers of 1847 are not whispers at all. They are a cry across the centuries, urging us to remember, to resist, and to build a world where no one has to set fire to injustice just to be free. No power built on injustice lasts. Oppression may seem eternal, but one day, even the mightiest walls will burn, and the crows will return to reclaim what was stolen.